and Future Child by Niels Henning Ørsted Peterson. Before the second half, we'll hear part of a conversation I had with Oscar Peterson in 1990. I began by asking if he'd acquired a sound classical technique before beginning to play jazz.
I think it was sound, by all means. I don't think it was any more than any youngster of that age. You know, we all studied the same teacher. As a matter of fact, in the Peterson household, it was handed down from the older members to the younger. You know, the older brothers and sisters would help the youngest ones with the music. And my dad would oversee all.
You studied at one point with this fellow Paul DeMarchi. And one of the extraordinary things about DeMarchi, again, which maybe is a different line on you as a jazz player than other jazz pianists, is that he was in a sort of direct line of descent from Liszt, because the teacher he studied with.
And he was very proud of this. And he always said I reminded him, for some reason, of Liszt. Even so much so, and one of the experiences I recall in an autobiography I'm working on right now, when he came to see me as recent as, I would say, the very early 80s, the Olympics in Montreal. He came to see me, and he was quite elderly at that time, and he was ill. And I remember when I came to the table after the performance, I hadn't seen him for years, you know, and I love this man, and still do, dearly. And I said, Mr. DeMarchi, he said, he just sort of shook his head and said, Liszt, Franz Liszt. I always said it, Franz Liszt. And, you know, so he really had an affinity for Franz Liszt.
Did he try to, because you were probably, by the time you came to him, already playing sort of jazz. I mean, you were already...
Oh, I was well into it.
But did he try to change you at all?
No. He was a jazz fan. He was a Tatumite and a Wilsonite. And he had all the records, not all, but he had many jazz records at home. And he'd play some of them for me and show me things that he thought he would like to hear me utilize in my playing, certainly pertaining to touch and things like that.
So the classical things applied as well to the jazz things you were doing?
Oh, well, you know, if you're going to play a piano, there's only one way to play it, and that's to play it. And if you're going to play it, I think the classical way is the way to go, because the classical feel encompasses all the full range of touch, tone, technique. You have that, you can basically master the instrument. The problem then is to be able to do something with the ideas that you have jazz-wise. By that time, I was in my very early teens, and I was well into the piano by then, and certainly well into the jazz world. I had a lot of idols. You know, I started listening to Basie's band and Lester Young and so forth and so on, and I became a devotee of Nat King Cole's. I used to work long hours trying to play things, because the whole idea of jazz is that if you think of an idea, you should be able to play it. I mean, the audience can't guess at what you intended to play. So this is where I think a lot of that comes from. I used to subconsciously fault a lot of players that I'd hear a phrase start on the instrument, and all I'd hear it end with was a lot of grunts and groans with what they intended, or they'd sing the rest of it. I'm not derogating anyone. I'm just saying that this used to frustrate me when I couldn't do it, and I decided to get rid of all of that if I could. You know, so that's the long hours at the keyboard at times.
When did you start gigging in Montreal?
I used to work with the high school band, which was a band led by Percy Ferguson, who was Maynard Ferguson's brother. And from Percy's band, I went to a local dance band in the west end of Montreal, led by Johnny Holmes. And I was with that band for better than 5 years because I wanted to get that kind of experience. I always intended to have a trio. That was always uppermost. Oh yeah, that was always.
Was that part of the Nat thing, or?
Yeah, that was because of Nat. When I heard that what Nat was doing, and certainly the Art Tatum trio, but not.
Sure, yeah.
I didn't want to go that way because I didn't think Art really needed a trio. It was more difficult for him to play with someone because he's so full of ideas and executions that the guys were stymied and almost obliterated at times.
Right.
But I always intended to have a trio, so consequently, before I did that, I wanted to get into some arranging and writing and composition and so forth. And I wanted to get the idea of a big band inside of me. So I stayed with the band for about 5 years.
I think you had to pay some dues commercially. At one point, you were known as the Brown Bomber of Boogie Woogie.
Yeah, the RCA Victor days.
Yeah.
As a tag that they put on me radio-wise, they used to, playfully refer to me that way, mainly because when I went with RCA at that time, the gentleman who wanted to record me insisted on Boogie Woogie, although that wasn't really part of my repertoire with the trio at the time.
What kind of things did you start to play when you left Johnny Holmes? I mean, that's when you started you had the job at the Alberta Lounge.
Yeah, I had Austin Roberts on bass, a local bassist, and Clarence Jones on drums. I started to play. The only way I can categorize that is to say they were the forerunner arrangements of the things that people heard later on with the trio with Ray Brown, Ned Thigpen, Herbie Ellis, and so forth.
And you were certainly aware of bebop. I mean, how much of a bebop climate was there in Montreal?
Big. I remember even Dizzy coming up to Montreal various times, and I remember he spent a weekend in town and virtually almost with me. He came out to my house and then he said, "I'm going to take you home with me because I want you to be at arm's length when I need you." One of those things. And we had a wonderful time.
From your experience with Dizzy, you were obviously getting known, at least by rumor, to guys in the States.
Yeah.
Was there interest and reaction floating up from down south?
Yeah, I had offers from various people to go with various bands. Jimmy Lunsford was talking about it. Bill Basie wanted me to take me back to the States, and my mother never could never figure out what he wanted with two piano players. You know? But well, we ended up doing the duets later on, so I guess
that's right.
Yeah, you know. But I wasn't really aiming for the U.S. quite that early. I was thinking about really putting together a trio. I knew what I wanted, what I was going after in Montreal, and I guess I was seasoning myself.
Yeah.
I'd put it that way. I was trying to season myself. And I wanted to be sure of certain things musically before I did any globe trotting. Because don't forget, at that time, just as you said earlier, various players used to come up from the U.S. In fact, we had various pianists come up from the U.S. after me. You know, yeah, really, we had the piano thing going for a while.
I mean, cutting sessions.
Yeah, cutting sessions. Yeah, they'd come up. I won't call any names. But a couple of guys would come and say, "All right, where is he? We heard he lives there." You know, it's like the old gunfighter routine. You know, it was a wonderful.
When did you finally make the leap then?
1949, I agreed to come down and do a concert with Jazz at the Phil at Carnegie, and that's when that 10-inch recording was done.
Yeah, and that was with
Ray Brown.
Norman Granz was the.
It was Norman's Jazz at the Philharmonic, and he came up to Montreal to promote for his concerts, and he heard our broadcast from the same Alberta Lounge, and he asked the cab driver who it was, and came down to the lounge and talked me into coming to. I wasn't really thinking of going quite that early, as I said earlier. And he said, "Well, it'd be a good test for you. Now, you want to bet your feet? Come on, try it. If it doesn't work, you know you don't have it. If it works, you can decide from there." And that's what I did.
How'd you feel about the reaction? I mean, the downbeat critic said you stopped the concert.
Oh, I wasn't paying that anymore.
Tracks.
I was just really, the first impact was the audience. The immediate, you know, I was there, and the audience was there, and I heard them cheering for Bird was on that concert.
Uh-huh.
You know, and along with some of the pretty heavy people in jazz. And I heard them cheer. I was sitting in the audience. They were all cheering for Bird and Lester Young and so forth. And when the intermission was drawing to a close, that was the time I realized this was it. This was either going to be the turning point of some kind in my career. And when I heard the response to my playing, I was just so pleased that I hadn't fallen flat on my face in Carnegie Hall.
Did you go back to Montreal?
Yes, I did. I didn't stay because, as I said, I wasn't prepared to start any kind of trotting around at that time. And Norman agreed that I wouldn't do anything until the following year's tour, which gave me a bit of grace to get things organized, you know, my life at home, if I was going to try it in the United States. Because that was a big tour they used to have. It was a 60-city tour they used to do. So, you know, I wasn't ready for this. I wasn't ready for a lot of things. I wasn't ready for the South. I wasn't ready for, you know, just generally. I hadn't been anywhere. I mean, I'd been across Canada, and I'd been, you know, that was my home. I was used to it. But I'd never traveled in the United States.
And especially with the cast he used to assemble for those concerts. And there you were.
Heavy duty. You know, it's amazing today when you think of the people that at that time we all took each other for granted, presence-wise, right? We don't today, because most of them are missing. Bill Harris, Coleman Hawkins, Lester Young, Charlie Shavers, Roy Eldridge, and on and on and on.
Yeah.
Buddy Rich. What's the name of that album? They ain't but a few of us left.
And had you started to hang out with Ray? I mean, were you a duo?
We started out as a duo. The problem with that duo was that most nightclub owners, before we got to strike a note, would see two guys come through the door and I would say, hey, for this kind of money, I want to see a big band up there. One of those things, you know. It wasn't like really that much money, but that's the way they were thinking, you know. Anything over $100 was a lot of money. It would be okay once we started to play, because I think, you know, Ray and I had it going pretty good as a duo. It was a pretty hot duo. It continued that way until, to be frank with you, it really got too difficult, became too difficult to have our income increase, because they really put up a shield about two guys filling clubs, and we were doing well. So Norman said, if for no other reason, even musically, why not please yourself and add a third? And we brought in Barney Kessel. So Barney was actually the first full U.S. trio. Barney, Ray Brown, and myself.
And then what? He was on the band for a year, and then Herbie
A year.
came.
He agreed to come in for a year because he was doing studio work then. And then he suggested Herbie, whom I had met because he was with a group called the Soft Winds.
Yeah, the
Lou Carter,
Jimmy
Johnny
Dorsey's
Frigo.
rhythm section.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
And so Herb agreed to come in, and that was the start of that famous trio, which is part of the reunion group now.
In a way, it was sort of the fulfillment of the ideas you'd already had in Montreal.
Yes.
That
Well, you know, with all due respect to the guys in Montreal, and they would be the first to say this, the things that Ray and Herbie were pulling off made it in some ways quite a bit easier for me to call for different things that I might not have been able to call for in Montreal.
The thing that still strikes me about both that group and, in a different way, the Thigpen group is what a group it is. I mean, you really have a trio sound. And I don't know if enough attention has been paid to the quality of the ensemble as an ensemble.
That's what we were most proud of. You know,
I
we
can believe
breathed
it.
together, we lived together, we thought together. It got to the point, believe it or not, Jeff, people sometimes don't believe this, but it happens to be true. There were times that I would come on the stand and I wouldn't call the tunes. I'd just count off 4. There was that kind of interactive thinking going on in the group. It's scary to talk this way.
Yeah.
But I just say, okay, let me have it. 1, 2, 2. And we'd all start playing the same tune for what? Don't ask me how. But I think it's just because of the, the closeness. You know, the strange thing, we didn't hang out all the time in the daytime as people might think. The only time we did was when we rehearsed, and that was a lot. We rehearsed an awful lot. We were dedicated to that. You know, I'm very proud of that group, those groups, because, you know, you play a gig from 9 o'clock in the evening until 3 or 3:30, like as we used to do in the London House in Chicago, and you break until 4:30 in the morning to let the club clear up, and then you have rehearsal from 4:30 till 8:30 in the morning. You're dedicated, or else you're idiots, one of the two. And we did this incessantly. And apart from that, Ray and Herbie I'd come by their rooms in the afternoon sometimes and be getting ready to knock, and I'd hear them in there rehearsing, not the arrangements per se. They'd be putting together a feel. They used to call it the carpet. You know, he said, let him walk on this, and let's get our end tight so that he won't stumble. And they made it so easy for me to play. I mean, people say to me, you know, it looks so easy when you play. Play with guys like that, it's not hard to play. It's no big deal.
Oscar Peterson, recalling his first great trio, reformed in the 90s with the addition of drummer Jeff Hamilton.